Welcome back. Welcome back. I really enjoyed that conversation. It was illuminating. It was really. It's always nice to hear some people having the same issues and challenges. To hear how different organisations are handling things. It's always an interesting insight to get. So thank you for my group for the interesting conversation. I want to make sure that we've built in a little bit of a break again before we hear from Bill Lucas at 12 o'clock. So let's go round some rooms. Shall we get feedback? I can never remember which number of room I was ever in, so I'm not going to do it on that basis in terms of number of room, but I'm going to do it on who was facilitating the session. So, Caroline, are you back? Can you facilitate and to feedback what was happening in your group?
Okay, thank you. And people who are in the group, please feel free to add. So we looked at the hopes and fears, in a sense, two sides of the same coin in the same conversation. And I think one of the biggest things was about equity for people versus roles, and that need to have a frontline service, and the fact that many of us have been doing some of both up till now. So for instance, today I'm on campus, I will do a desk slot, but actually I feel quite de-skilled in being part of that desk slot and slightly uncomfortable. But one of the other things that came up was the role of online chat. And so people who are on the front desk might also be doing chat as a first line of inquiry, but what that means in terms of where they might be based, because in theory they could do chat at home. And lots of colleagues in the breakout group commented on the amount that online chat has gone up. So one colleague commented that it had gone up 200% during lockdown. So clearly the amount of resource that needs to be put to chat needs to be reconsidered in that. Creating some boundaries for ourselves and being able to do that was another huge thing that came up, and that kind of balance between managing our own expectations and those of both our users and the staff student managing expectations. So one of the themes that came up was that people who are in teaching roles may have been doing more frontline, but they're going to need to withdraw from that to be able to fulfill their teaching and academic liaison role.
Thank you.
Also, sorry.
Oh, sorry, no, I haven't finished. Carry on.
Just a quick point about number 3 then was that we're at the early stages of our organisations looking at what might happen, and hybrid, agile, flexi time, flexi working, all these words, and a slight concern that different organisations may be interpreting those words in different ways.
And probably that within the same organisation, the same terms are being interpreted in different ways. So yeah, cross-organisation, who cares? Intra, disaster. So thank you. Really interesting points. Moving on, Delith.
Hello.
Hi.
Yes, so we had a little bit of an overlap with some of the stuff Caroline said, so I won't kind of dwell on those bits, but we kind of talked a little bit about some concerns. So that mainly was around the equity of all staff, really, and how we have some frontline who can't or might not be able to work quite so flexibly as, say, the librarians in some instances. But we did talk about how there was such a jump to the online chat that actually there might be more drive for using that and less of a requirement for physical face-to-face inquiry points. There was also a slight concern about whether the kind of flexible approach would equate to changing the expectation of when we're working, and whether there'll be more of an expectation from our users that we should deliver like a non-traditional 9 to 5 approach. And then in terms of what we'd like to keep from what we've done over the past year or so, we talked a lot about one-to-ones, and I think the general consensus was that they've worked well online and that we'd like to keep them where we can online. They've certainly worked really well with healthcare professionals or postgrads who are working at the same time. Also a feeling that people will book a one-to-one just for one question or a 10-minute discussion where they wouldn't have done previously. Edinburgh have done a survey into this kind of the student experience of the one-to-ones recently, and there was no specific responses about the method in which it was delivered. So kind of the expectation, or the assumption rather, is that the method of delivery isn't important, just that the service is offered. And then we talked very briefly about teaching, and I think most people are on board now with flipped learning because they've got the resources, the video resources there to use. So it didn't feel like people would just go back to the way they were teaching previously, even if they are going back to doing it face to face. And then some of the benefits of teaching online being the anonymity that the students have, so they've contributed more because of the anonymity. And so with the expectation with some universities that we go back to the face-to-face delivery, how do people continue to deliver that kind of engagement when you're back in a classroom?
Interesting. Yeah, the point that the route of offer is less important than the fact that the offer is there. Certainly, I mean, not every young person is super tech happy, but maybe there's a broader spectrum of just saying, yeah, people can cope with this actually better than we're maybe giving them credit for. So just being able to offer it at all is good. And there's probably so much travel involved across campuses at the best of times that it gives them a much better chance of attending because they don't have to leave their office or their lab or their desk. I know that that's always been an issue in Cambridge, however tiny Cambridge actually is. Interesting, thanks Della. Lucy, next up.
Right, thank you. So we had quite a kind of wide-ranging discussion. We started out talking about the acknowledgement of lower paid, lower grade staff often being the ones who are frontline and who are in the office, and there being a little bit of kind of pressure on some librarians to feel that they should go work in the office if able, to kind of show solidarity to a degree. So there are some hopes that there'll be increased flexibility for hybrid options for lower grade staff. But I think that is something that probably is going to be discussed a lot more going forwards. That sort of led on to a discussion of kind of the impact short part-time contracts being quite challenging, particularly for managers who are trying to negotiate flexible working. It makes it quite challenging when you have staff whose contracts are very specific to specific gaps in the service that they need to fill, and then staff who are on the same sort of contract but on different hours having more flexibility. So there being some sort of perceived inequalities there, where the reality is the service requirements kind of have to override personal preference in some circumstances. So we decided that kind of the key to that is making sure you're, as a manager, that you're doing this kind of negotiation transparently and keeping the honesty really open. But then there are challenges for managers because it can be difficult if you're managing individuals who don't want you to be that transparent about their personal situations. You do have to bear in mind personal circumstances, rights to privacy, that kind of thing. So a little bit of a kind of walking a tightrope situation there in some cases. There were some concerns about the lack of like a possible lack of engagement with the user base when we're making these big decisions about big changes. And we talked about kind of the key to that is making sure that you still have that frontline service. So you still have a face on the desk that people can come up to and talk to. And this led on to some conversations about how the biggest challenge for libraries is that we have always wanted to be everything for everyone. And now that's even harder because you've got so many more expectations in some ways. So kind of acknowledging that we're still in a really tumultuous period. So while it may feel like things are sort of static at the moment because we've been in a holding pattern for quite a while, some of us, actually it is still a period of a lot of uncertainty and unrest. So we don't know what we want yet, and the users don't necessarily know what they want yet. So making sure that we are having an agile approach so that we can adapt and change. It's probably going to be a number of years before we're absolutely kind of settled on any particular way of doing things, and that's kind of okay. So that's, I think, unless someone wants to jump in, I think that's pretty much covers what we discussed.
Yeah, that desire to be settled, because there's been so much change and so much variety over the past year. Yeah, we've got to just, I mean, my goodness, medical librarianship guaranteed as the source of constant change in library services that can sometimes, I'm speaking for my own university library service, can sometimes not feel like it's changed in the last 400 years. But medical librarianship is a constant source of change, but sometimes it's just exhausting, isn't it? But we know that this is still very much a period of flux. Interesting. I was in the room. I knew it was interesting. Interesting feedback. Thank you very much, Lucy. And finally, Jane. Jane, from your group.
Yes, hello. So yes, please, if I miss anything, my fellow room colleagues, please do chip in. Obviously, we discussed the wide-ranging questions. A lot of what you've said, we touched on and agree with and commented on. I think the main things I want to just bring out from what we said in room 5 was one, I can't remember who it was, but one was an interesting point where with this whole move and flexible learning, flexible working, hybrid learning, was looking at job descriptions and sort of really unpicking them to see what could be, you know, what jobs are there, what jobs can be done from home, what jobs can we do on campus or need to be done on campus, and sort of starting again from that side. So I think that was quite interesting, and whether, you know, that might be something that other places perhaps should do, that sort of more forensic look at job descriptions, to sort of then build up to make sure that things are more equitable, there's less inequality and things like that, or certainly to show that all staff at least make sure that they don't feel that there is inequality. The other thing, we had quite a few people who worked in the NHS as well as academia, and obviously with NHS staff, they were often on campus all the time throughout lockdowns, often did other jobs, or a lot of, but again, there was still the imbalance where some staff, professional staff, were doing like photocopying, and you know, so there's all been that tensions and how that will be resolved in the future. And then I think the other key thing that came out from our group was the need to be student focused and student centered, and maybe to do surveys. And I'm sure, you know, we as librarians, we aren't forgetting our students, but sometimes maybe it feels that some of the decisions maybe our universities or our organisations might do, whether we work in a university or is it user, is it end user focused, the student focused? So I think that's the importance to keep in mind, and what will benefit them, and do we ask them? And I know I'm aware that some people are doing surveys, which sounds great. I'm sure I've missed something important, but
I think the concept of what jobs are getting done, what jobs need to continue to be doing, what jobs can have been binned because we've moved it online or in some other way. So the review of jobs is, it creates more uncertainty, but it's clearly a great, it's an opportunity to do that, which makes a lot of sense. The user focusedness of all of these changes seems to be coming up again and again, doesn't it? It's like we're making all these changes and a lot of this is forced upon us, but so much of it would have been driven by, as Lucy said in our session, by a UX perspective to be starting with. Are we making and keeping and developing and binning and inventing new things that we think are good, or are we always keeping the users in mind? Because as I say, at the end of the day, it's the point of us, isn't it? It's the point of us. Rick, have you got...
Yes, so I had a group as well. So just to...
Oh, I can't hear you.
Can you not hear me?
Oh, no, now I can. Now I can. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, so yeah, I had a group as well. So just to feedback really briefly on...
beg your pardon. Thank you.
Okay. We had quite a lot of discussion, so I'll try and rip through it really quite quickly. There was a feeling that some people had had quite enough of working from home. I guess we've all been doing this about 18 months or so, so I think that's entirely understandable. There was a bit of a concern that obviously this might lead to, and it may be a deliberate intention of organisations for this use of space to change, and might we ever get that back again? if we needed to change back in some way. And also, if we are doing things like hot desking and so on, we end up with this requirement of carrying an office around our back all the time. And how can we cope with that if we're always lugging a laptop around with us? There's also issues about how easy it's going to be if we are hot desking to book space. How much time are we going to lose to find somewhere to actually work, to have to go through the booking process? And if we are at home, it feels like it can sometimes make it more difficult to define a proper end to our working day. There was a discussion about the terminology as well. So there's a mixture. Some places are talking about flexible learning. Then we've also got agile and blended working. Sorry. We've got people who are finding it quite difficult to structure the day when they're just working from home, and finding that activities are kind of becoming overlapped. We're starting to work when we're also doing stuff at home, and it's blurring everything that we're doing really between our sort of work and home lives. And also, if we are putting our support information up online, that can be accessed. Once we've done it once, it's kind of done. So I suppose we're saving time in terms of repeating teaching, but at the same time, then we only need to do it once. And are we doing ourselves out of a job? Or on the flip side, once we put something up and it can be used again next year, well, we know everything in our world changes all the time. Databases change, all this kind of thing. But once we put it online, our academics and students can be using that from, say, 5 years ago, when actually the reality is everything has all changed. Okay. On the positive sides, it's much easier now if you are at home to sort of wake up properly and feel really ready for the day before you jump on the computer. And you can mix and match sort of in the middle of the day. You can go off and do a little bit of gardening, which obviously you couldn't do if you're in the office, which is nice. Then some people find they're less distracted when they're at home. I guess other people find that the case when they're actually on site. And there's also the feeling that actually now we're feeling more trusted to work at home. I certainly know in my organization, we were starting to have discussions about working from home, but there definitely were questions from senior management about, well, how can we be certain that people are working? Now it's just, we know that people will. There's not those concerns at senior level aren't really there. People have been able to attend more training and involve themselves in conferences such as UHMLG. Which they might not have otherwise been able to do because it's online. And teams are able to keep in touch with each other in ways that they wouldn't have done before. And it's forced us to use the tech like Teams and so on that maybe we didn't quite know how it would work, how it would benefit us previously. And it's also been useful for distance learners. And the added flexibility that we've got has been a benefit to NHS staff, supporting them in that we're able to, do like a quick online one-to-one with them when we might not have been able to, they may not have been able to visit the library in person, and the actual hours that we're working have been a bit more flexible, and that's kind of fitted in with NHS staff, with students rather better as well. Yeah, so I think that covers most of it.
I recognise so many of the points that you're making across all of the teams. There's such a common sort of position. There's so much solidarity. Not necessarily any answers yet, but it's so much solidarity, and just knowing everybody's in a similar position sometimes is half the help. Knowing how we can influence and change the situation for ourselves, negotiate and influence how others are seeing it in our teams, or perhaps negotiating with managers as to how to make it a better situation for ourselves, is what hopefully Bill Lucas will be helping us with at 12 o'clock. So 10 minutes to have a little refresh, have a little bit of stretching and arm shuggling and all the rest of it that you need just to be braced and ready for the final push for 12 o'clock. Have a wee break. It was brilliant. Thank you for those conversations and all those insights. Have a break. We'll see you back at 12.